Before we log our user in, there is one thing I would like us to do first, and that is to perform form validation. If we go to our register form as it is now and click on the register button without filling out the form, our system is going to create a user with empty values for the email and the username and so on. And this is not what we want, so we are going to perform a check to ensure that there are no errors on the form before we create our user. In order to achieve this, we are going to initialize a new array variable called errors, and we are going to use this array variable to store our error messages if there is any. So the way we check for an input field is we are going to use a method provided by PHP called empty, which checks whether a variable value is empty. So we start with the username submitted from the form. If the username is empty, then we should put an error inside our errors array that will have a message that says the username is required. So we use a function provided by PHP called arrayPush, and what this function does is it adds a certain value to a certain array. So this is our empty array right now. We'll put the value as the array variable as the first argument. This is the array to which we want to add a value, and the next argument is the value that we are adding to the array, which is a string that says username is required. So with this, if you submit the register form without providing a username, this string username is required will be added onto the errors array. So let's test this out. We're just going to display the errors, whatever we have inside the errors array on the screen, and see how it looks. So let's submit our form again without filling out any of the input fields. So it checks it and finds that there is no username, and it pushes the string username is not required onto the errors array, and this is how the errors array looks. We can do the same thing for the email. We check if the email is empty, then we'll push a string that says email is required. If we go back and submit our form again with empty values, you will see now that there is another error that says email is required. Also, we want to make sure that our password, the user has provided a password. So we'll check also for password, and if it's not there, we are going to say password required. We're also going to do the same for the password confirmation. And also we are going to check if the two passwords match. So we are going to have another if statement. The text in this case, if it fails, we are going to say passwords do not match. And the check, we are going to check using the equals sign. So if password confirmation is not equal to the password itself, then we know that the passwords do not match. Okay, so we go back to our form. If you submit an empty form, it is going to say password required. Now this is happening 2 times because it does it once for the password and does it again for the password confirmation. So let me just remove this one for the password confirmation. And sorry, not the password, not the equality. We remove the check for the empty password confirmation. And then when we submit again with empty values, these are the error messages. Okay, so let's try the cases where the user has submitted all, but the 2 passwords do not match. So if you submit now, it will say the 2 passwords do not match. You don't see the other errors because I provided the other fields. So we can say now that our validation is working. So if I remove this statement that displays, and before we save the user to the database, we are going to perform a check. We are going to ensure that there are no errors. So we'll say if count errors is equal to 0. This simply says that if the number of items inside the errors variable is 0, in other words, if there are no errors, then we're going to copy this code, we'll cut the code and paste it inside the if statement. So this code will only execute if there are no errors. So if there are errors, nothing happens. The form just stays there, and yeah. So if we submit, it doesn't create the user, and that's just it. But this is not what we want our user to experience. We want them to be informed of the errors, of the mistakes they are making. So we want a way of displaying the validation errors on the form so that they can get that feedback and then act accordingly. Now, if we go to our register.php file, on the register form, you're going to notice some commented code. And we had prepared this when we had been designing the website. So let's just uncomment that code, and then we go back to our browser and refresh. And it is just going to show us an example of how a validation message is going to look. So right now, we are declaring our errors variable inside our users.php file, and we are including that users.php file inside our register. So that makes the errors variable available inside our register form. So we can just do an if statement, a simple if statement to check if there are errors. So we'll do that by doing an if statement if the number of items inside the errors array is greater than 0, which means there are at least 1 errors in the form. Then we will move this snippet of code into the if statement. And then since it is an array of errors and not only one error, we are going to loop inside this div and display all the errors that are in the errors variable. So in PHP we can loop using the for each syntax. So I will just say for each errors as error, display that particular error. So here the error message now will be error. Okay, so let me explain this again. We are going to test if there are errors inside our errors array, and we do that using the count function that PHP provides. If there are more than 0 errors, which means if there are at least 1 errors, then we are going to loop through however many errors there are, and we'll display each of them in a list element. So error here is 1, and then errors is the entire array. So each time in the loop, the current error is error without the s, and we are displaying it. So if we go back to our form and we click on this, you will see now that all the available errors are being displayed on our form. So we are sure that our error messages are being displayed. But if you enter the username, for example, and you click register, the other error messages appear, but your username is gone. So this is not good user experience, because let's say you have a form with about 50 of these input fields and you fill 49 of them correctly, and you click the submit button and there is an error with only one of them. Now you have lost every other 49 fields and you have to start filling the form from afresh. That is not good user experience. So we want to persist the value that the user entered correctly as we display the validation message for them to fill in the others correctly. So now we are going to go inside our users.php file and we're going to define a few variables. The first is the username. It's going to be empty string, and we'll also have the email empty string 2, the password empty string, and the password confirmation, which is also an empty string. Now this if statement says that if there are no errors, create the user. But what if there are errors? So in the else block, it says that it means that this else block will be executed if there are errors. So what if there are errors? If there are errors, we are going to maintain the values that the user submitted inside these variables. We are going to give those values to these variables to hold so that we can then put these variables back inside the input fields so that the user may not have to fill them again. So the way we'll do this is I'm just going to copy all these 4 variables and paste them down here. So the username that they entered was stored inside the post variable, the post array. So we are just going to maintain it here. The same for the email. Let me just scroll this up a bit. And then the same for the password. And also the password confirmation. Okay. So now these values have been initialized outside of the if statement. So if you submit the register button and there happen to be errors on the form, the values that you submitted will be put inside these variables that we initialized up here. And then on our form, we can put those values inside our form using the value attribute. So we're just going to echo username here. Now, this username variable is the one we initialized here, and we are able to use it inside our register.php again because we are including the users.php file inside our register.php. That is why we have access to this users variable. Sorry, to this username variable. We can do the same thing for these others, the email, the password, and lastly, the password confirmation. The password confirmation. So if we go back to our form now, and let's say we enter the username and we click register, it says the email is required, the password is required, but we don't have to enter our username again. The same thing for the email. It remains there, as well as the password. It remains there. So this is better for our user experience. So right now there is just one last thing I want to wrap up before the end of this video. So right now we are displaying form errors on our register form. When we are working on the login form, we'll probably want to display form errors too. So what I want to do is I want to remove these errors, this part of the code that displays the errors, into a different file, and then I can include that file here. In order to achieve that, I will create a folder inside the app folder. Let's just create a new folder called helpers, and inside the helpers folder I'm going to create a file called formerrors.php. Now inside this form errors file, I'm just going to cut this code we have here. We don't need an opening tag. I'll just paste it inside here. And then here, using our root path variable as usual, we are going to navigate from the app folder into the helpers folder and then into form errors.php. So this will just be the same as having that code here in our form. So if we go back to our browser, let's just confirm that this still works, and of course it still works. So if we click, our validation messages still display. Now another last thing I would like us to do is with the validation. Right now, this our if statement is supposed to create a user when the user clicks on the register button, but it is validating the user as well. And from what you can see here, this function is already looking very big. So what I want us to do is, I want to create a file inside the helpers folder called validateuser.php, and inside this file we'll define a function called validateuser, and it will take the user that we want to validate and then return errors. Of course, we are also going to define the errors like we did inside our users.php. So here is the users file. I'm just going to cut everything from the errors right down to the validation for the password. I'll cut it and then I paste it inside the validate user. Now the validate user function returns the errors that arise. So here I can call that validate user function and pass in the user information to that function, and the function will validate that user information and return the errors. This user information here is received as user, so we are going to change all these post variables to user. So it receives the user data and then checks the various fields. If there happens to be any errors, it pushes error messages into the errors array that we are initializing here, and then it returns those errors. We here now, we grab those errors and then we can begin to perform our checks. So one very last thing is, how can we access this validate user here when we have not yet included it? So what we need to do is, we need to include the validate user function, the validate user file inside our users.php file so that we can have access to this function. So we'll start from the root path into the app folder, this folder, and then helpers, and then validate user. Helpers and validate user.php. So if we save this and go back to our browser and we click register, it still works. Alright, so okay guys, that is quite a lot for one video, and I hope you were able to follow up closely and to get it to work. In the next video, we are going to be working on logging our user in after the register. So I hope you found this video helpful, and if you have any questions at all, if anything is not clear in this episode, please leave it in the comments below and I will attend to you. And one quick announcement, I have decided to try as much as possible to respond to almost any comments in this particular series, especially the ones that have to do with with code not working. So if you have any issues, drop in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next episode.